as I've thought about this topic over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that's come to mind is that there's an irony, I think, in the fact that we would even be having a conversation about putting the local in the local church. If you talked to pastors, if you talked to Christians, 2, 3, 4, 500 years ago, this question wouldn't have made any sense. The church was a local entity. The church was a local presence, and it was primarily experienced as a local entity and a local experience. So that's what I'm going to talk a lot about today, is why that isn't the case, like why this is a question now, why this is something that matters now. It matters because we live in a world that's pretty flat now. It's socially flat, it's economically flat, it's technologically and economically flat. And what's difficult in a technologically flat world is real presence, is actually being present to the people around you. We're perpetually drawn out, we're perpetually distracted by technology, by entertainment, by media of all kinds. The challenge for the church then is how do we have a sense of place and a sense of connection to a place and to a community? How do we care about cities? How do we care about neighborhoods? How do we care about what's real and concrete and right in front of us when we live in a society where everything's abstracted and everything's distracted and everything comes to us from a distance, comes to us through mass media? To dig into this, I'm going to consult with 3 different prophets. Only one of them is canonical, and I recognize that. The other 2 are more contemporary, lowercase p prophets. And they are the prophet Jeremiah, and then 2 contemporary thinkers, Wendell Berry and Hannah Arendt, a philosopher. And we'll start with Jeremiah. And particularly, I want to start with Jeremiah chapter 29. This is a familiar passage probably to many of us. But just to sort of lay the background again, Jeremiah 29 is a letter that the prophet Jeremiah is writing to Israel in exile. What's happened is Babylon has conquered Israel. He's come in, the king of Babylon has sent his armies in, and he's basically captured kind of the top tier of the society, and he's dragged them all away. So the king's advisors and the lead craftsmen, intellectuals, thinkers, politicians, that sort of folks. And he's dragged them away, and he's dragged them into exile. And from exile, what happens is this cluster, this community, is drawn by 2 poles. One pole says, look, Babylon's already won. Our God has been conquered by Babylon and Babylon's gods, so let's just go ahead and assimilate. What Babylon wanted was not to completely eliminate Israel's religion and its history. It wanted to incorporate it. It wanted to assimilate it. It was a pluralistic society, and so the pressure was conform. Let Yahweh be one God amongst the many gods. Let's just sort of be part of this new pluralistic reality. The other tension, the other pressure came from a bunch of false prophets from Israel's midst. And these false prophets were saying, no, God has spoken and he's told us he's going to get us out of here. We're going to get rescued. This is a short-lived thing. Don't even unpack your bags. We're going home, and we're going home soon. And so to these folks, Jeremiah shows up, and this is what he says. He says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile, from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you might find your welfare. The passage then goes on to essentially rebuke both sides of this tension. To the assimilationists, it reaffirms God is coming back. God is coming back, and he's coming back. He's going to redeem them. He's going to bring them home. To the false prophets, though, he says, but this isn't happening for 70 years. This is a long way off. And so essentially, Jeremiah is saying, you need to settle into this place because God has sent you to the place. If you look at the verbs in the passage, it's very clear that God has sent them there and that he wants them to thrive. He wants them to bless the place. He wants them to leave it better than they found it. So to the assimilationists, it's this rebuke of don't be sucked into this world. Don't compromise who you are as God's people. And to the false prophets, he's saying, again, not for 70 years. And the number 70 is interesting there. Different commentaries say different things, but it's invoking creation. And it's invoking this idea that, in the 7 days of creation, there was a work to be done. So in this place, there's a work to be done. This investment in this place means that there's a calling for these people to get to work. And then the Sabbath is invoked by the number 7 as well, the seventh day. There will be a Sabbath rest and there will be a Sabbath joy at the end of the exile. But 70 years, that's a long time, and most of them realize that 70 years will all be dead. So to make a John Piper joke here, essentially Jeremiah is saying, don't waste your exile, right? God's point is thrive in this place. The verbs are build, marry, plant, grow, increase. He's saying, bless this place. Your thriving is tied up in the local thriving. Leave it better than you found it. Think about that as part of our church's mission. What does it mean for us to leave the city, to leave the neighborhood, to leave the community where we exist better than we found it? In our modern, disconnected, disaffected societies, one of the best gifts we can give our congregations is a sense of place, a sense of connection to their place. While the church's worship shouldn't necessarily have a sense of place as a primary goal, it should be part of the overall mission and goal of the church. Love and bless the place that you are. And if that's fuzzy, then one of the things that is definitely clear is that we should at least do no harm, right? At the very least, whatever we're doing in our worship culture should hopefully not disconnect people more from their sense of place. It shouldn't damage their sense of connection to a specific location and a specific community. So with Jeremiah here in the background, let's talk a little bit about Wendell Berry. If you're not familiar with Berry's story, Berry was born in Henry County, Kentucky. He went to the University of Kentucky and to study creative writing, got a master's degree. He went off to Berkeley. He was in Berkeley in the late 1950s, early 60s. He was connected to writers like Wallace Stegner and Ken Kesey. He was brilliant, and it was obvious that he was brilliant, obvious enough that he was awarded a Guggenheim grant. He went to Italy for a while and wrote over there and studied over there. Landed in around 1961 at NYU, became a professor of writing there, was writing and publishing in all of the places that as a writer you would dream of writing and publishing, places like the New Yorker, the New York Times, sort of the pinnacle of the literary world. And then all of a sudden in 1964, Berry went home. He left NYU, he left his academic career essentially behind. He went home to Henry County, Kentucky, and he moved into a shack on the Kentucky River. And he spent the rest of his life, to this day, he's still there. He's farming, he's writing, he's investing in this land that he bought back then. Berry's move caused his colleagues to kind of freak out and think that he'd lost his mind. But what it actually did when you read Berry's writing is it made him more bold and more prophetic. Berry is an equal opportunity offender. He hates big government and he hates big corporations. He's got a deep sense and a deep concern for place and for connection. And for us as pastors, there's almost nobody that I could think of recommending to you more than the writings of Wendell Berry to think about what it means to love a place and love a community. Whether you read his fiction or his essays, it's all there. I want to talk specifically about an essay that he wrote called Damage. It's in a book of his called What Are People For? We're often immune and insensitive to the consequences of our impact on a place and on the connections that people have to their sense of place. Berry in his writing is concerned with the mindless acceptance of technology and tools. He's got a rant about e-readers that will crack you up. But specifically, I want to talk about this essay, Damage. I think when we think about what we're doing as worship leaders, we need to think about the fact that we are in charge of a culture. We plan worship services, we plan these gatherings, we plan these experiences, and everything about this is essentially we're cultivating something that people live in. We're cultivating this worshiping life of a community. And we need to think about it as something that we cultivate. We need to think about it as a culture. And we need to ask ourselves, how does this culture affect our sense of place and our connection to one another? Those who plan worship services need to recognize that what they're doing with each prayer, scripture reading, song, and with every aesthetic decision, piece of technology you incorporate, and comment you make into a microphone is in some way or another cultivating the soil of a community's culture. To be local then is to be of a place. It means to have a locale, a sense of origins, a sense of belonging. And what I want to focus on then is how we cultivate that sense of place and how we might intentionally or unintentionally be leaving people disconnected from the place that God has sent them and called them. So here's a few excerpts from Berry's essay, Damage. He says, I have a steep wooded hillside that I wanted to be able to pasture occasionally, but it had no water supply. About halfway to the top of a slope, there was a narrow bench on which I thought I could make a small pond. I hired a man with a bulldozer to dig one. He cleared away the trees and formed the pond, cutting the hill on the upper side, piling the loosened dirt and a curving earthwork on the lower. The pond appeared to be a success. Before the bulldozer quit work, water had begun to seep in. Soon there was enough to support a few head of stock. To heal the exposed ground, I fertilized it and sowed it with grass and clover. We had an extremely wet fall and winter, with the usual freezing and thawing. The ground grew heavy with water and soft. The earthwork slumped. A large slice of the wood's floor on the upper side slipped down into the pond. The trouble was a familiar one. Too much power, too little knowledge. The fault was mine. I was careful to get expert advice, but this only exemplifies what I already knew. No expert knows everything about every place, not even everything about any place. If one's knowledge of one's whereabouts is insufficient, if one's judgment is unsound, then expert advice is of little use. Barry goes on to talk about how this damage that he did to the land really troubled him. It really bothered him. He said, the pond was a modest piece of work, and so the damage is not extensive. In the course of time and nature, it will heal. And yet there is damage to my place and to me. I've carried out before my own eyes and against my intention a part of the modern tragedy. I've made a lasting flaw in the face of the earth for no lasting good. My peace is damaged, and I will not be able to forget it. It used to be that I could think of art as a refuge from such troubles. I'm no longer able to think that way. That's because I now live in my subject. My subject is my place in the world, and I live in my place. There's a sense in which I no longer go to work. If I live in my place, which is my subject, then I am at my work even when I am not working. It is my work because I cannot escape it. And then towards the end of the essay, he says this, a man with a machine and an inadequate culture, such as I was when I made my pond, is a pestilence. He shakes more than he can hold. So a couple things to note about this passage that I think is interesting. First is Barry has this sense of connection and responsibility with his land, with what he's been called to steward and to cultivate it. He says he doesn't go to work, but he lives in the midst of its work. There's an interdependence between the place and the work that he's been called to do. There's a sense of connection to the place's thriving and to its health, and that alone could be a great start for us thinking about what it means to be a local church and connected to a local sense of place. In our kind of modern world, we think everything in terms of sort of economics. There's a cost and there's a benefit. There's a red column and a black column. And oftentimes if the black column, so long as the black column, the benefits column outweighs the costs column, everything is fine. And in this case, there was loss, but ultimately his farm was going to be fine. He was going to move on. And yet the damage troubles him. He doesn't let the fact that he can move on and that things are going to be okay stop him from noticing and feeling the pain. I think for us as pastors, this is a brilliant insight. We talk about the success of church plants and growing churches, but what about the churches in our cities that atrophy while members run off to the newest, flashiest thing? What about the economic and social impact of churches that are part of gentrifying neighborhoods? What about the impact of churches moving out of the city and into the suburbs? What damage gets done when we innovate in ministry? If we love our cities, we have to think beyond the bottom line. We have to think about the health of the place in a more holistic way. Much more could be said here about economics and mercy and benevolence, but I'm actually just going to focus from here out on the worshiping culture of a church. Is it possible that our worship culture can be doing damage? With that in mind, I want to talk about one instance of what it might mean. Barry said the problem was too much power and too little knowledge. So what would too much power look like in a worshiping culture? What, to use Barry's story as a metaphor, what's the bulldozer? Who's the hired man that we're outsourcing our church culture to? The answer, as I see it, is best defined as mass culture. Mass culture and mass media are the primary way that we've experienced, the primary culture that we've experienced our whole lives. Mass media, mass culture, by its very nature, is anti-local. It's made so that it can cross geographic and ethnic and social boundaries to reach as wide an audience as possible. To get a grip on what mass culture means, let's think again about the culture of a church from 500 years ago, and particularly church music from 500 years ago. Musicians worked as apprentices to learn music. Manuscripts were treasured and hard to come by. Most of the music that somebody experienced their whole lives, probably all of the music they experienced their whole lives, was folk music in the truest sense. It was music that they experienced live in a context of people they knew, in a community that they knew, in a church gathering or in some other social context that was part of their ordinary everyday life. It was a shared experience. Even after the invention of the printing press and the Reformation, music in the church was still something that was local and communal. You knew music as it sounded in a specific place with a specific people. Your understanding of it and experience of music was local and relational. You knew it and you experienced it as expressed through your parish, your village, your local community. Music in this sense was a common good in the truest sense of the word. It was something that was formed and shared and protected in community. Wendell Berry defines community like this. He says, community is a locally understood interdependence of local people, local culture, local economy, and local nature. The idea of patronage, that the community would support art and artists, makes much more sense in this kind of a context. Artists in their work was something that was shared. It was a common good. So you invested in them so that they could do their work and the community as a whole could draw from it and benefit from it. And of course, there are other means of common goods than music. I'll tell you the story of one of my favorite examples of this, and that's in the city of Dublin, there's the river Liffey. It runs right through the center of the city. And a number of times over the course of history, the city of Dublin has wanted to redirect the flow of water out of the city, run it along the outside of the city. And there's a variety of good economic and political reasons to do that. It would improve the flow of traffic in the city. It would improve property values. They could build, they could expand, they could simplify the way water in the whole city kind of worked. And so these initiatives would come out. They'd say, they'd tell the city, we're gonna redirect the flow of the water. At the same time, there were private interests that resisted. People depended on this river. Eminent domain might be invoked. People might lose their property in the process of construction. Now, if you go to Dublin today, you'll find that the river is still there, and the reason is because of a common good. Not the private interests of one person or one or two persons, but because of something that the vast majority of the city of Dublin valued enough as theirs, as their treasure, that they were willing to resist the institutions that wanted to redirect the flow of the river. And it wasn't because of the water in the river. The community showed up each time the efforts to redirect the river began and protected their common good and their communal interests. At times, one time they actually showed up at arms to stop the construction project. And the reason for this was because of the Guinness factory. The Guinness factory is right in the heart of Dublin, and the River Liffey runs right by it, and Guinness is made with water from the River Liffey. And so the idea was that the redirecting the flow of the river, Guinness would suddenly have to find a new water source. And so things might change, new water, new processes for making Guinness, maybe a new factory altogether. The common interdependent interests of the people of Dublin, who shuddered to think that someone might mess with their Guinness, caused them to show up in arms. They had a sense of commonwealth in this resource, the river, and common good with the Guinness company. And I know some of you may be offended by the mention of Guinness. Let me encourage you, there's a book, it's called Searching for God in Guinness, and the Guinness story is amazing. It's an amazing story. Arthur Guinness was a convert of John Wesley's and worked for the good of that city. It's a beautiful story. But again, there's this sense that this is ours, this is shared, your interest, my interest, our good, our thriving, they're all bound up together. It's worth preserving and it's worth protecting. And this is something to note about culture and community. It demands the work of preservation and conservation. It has to be continually attended to and cared for because the momentum of culture, of progress, quote unquote, will often threaten to eat it up or to let it die. So let's begin to think about this idea of a commonwealth being true for the local church as well. You can see this in again, the worshiping life of a church from a time before. The community raised the funds to build cathedrals and parishes. They had a sense of common interest in the worshiping life of the church. The experience of worship, the music, the liturgy, the sound of the space, the year in, year out celebrations of Christmas and Easter, springtime and harvest, it was all built around the sense of commonwealth, common good in the spiritual, liturgical, and worshiping life of that congregation. More specifically, you didn't know worship music apart from the gathered church, and you didn't know music at all as an isolated, preference-driven experience. You knew it as something that was communal, shared, whether in the life of your church or in some other social context in the cities. Even if someone was well-traveled and moved around a lot and gathered with many different congregations, their experience of music was still always tied to a worshiping life of a particular people in a particular place. There were no conferences. There were no worship concerts. There were no recordings for them to experience. In this sense, we can start to get the vision of worship leaders in these contexts. They were the curator of this common good, this commonwealth, this musical resource that this community had. And I think it really ties in nicely with Jesus' comments in Matthew chapter 13, where he says that teachers in the kingdom are people who bring out treasures old and new to the church. Worship leaders, what if we begin to think of ourselves as curators of treasures old and new that we brought out and gave to our churches? I think this historical background gives us an interesting place where we can begin to think about what life is like now when we live with these, right? This incredible device, which some of you are laughing at because it's a 5 and not a 6, it's already a dinosaur, right? When I pull this thing out, when I hold it in front of my face, the moment I pull it out, I'm now disconnected from you. You have no idea what's on here. I could be, FaceTiming with somebody right now. I could be reading emails. I could be getting text messages. I once was giving a lecture at a worship conference a few months ago, and I always have this out to keep an eye on my time, and I forgot to put it on airplane mode, and a friend of mine started blowing me up the entire time I was trying to teach. But that's what can happen. This thing can disconnect us, right? It can immediately, the moment you're sitting in a conversation with somebody or you're sitting across from someone at the dinner table, the moment they pull out their phones, we find ourselves begun to disconnect from one another. And that's the nature of the device. At any moment, I could get a call and I could take it, walk out of this room. That's what this world is like. And inside this phone, what's so appealing, what's so addictive about this thing is that this phone is totally directed at me, at my tastes, at what I want to experience, at what I want to listen to and I want to watch. It feeds my own narcissistic sense of being in charge and of being a god. And if I don't want to pay attention to something that's on it, I can quickly click away. I can go to a different social media network. I can go to my email. I can go surf. I can go find whatever I want to do. And the amount of information that is a click away is mind-blowing. A few minutes ago, Bob was talking about this, and he said tens of thousands of songs. And actually, he's way wrong. It's 26 million songs on iTunes alone right now that you can download with a click. Not all of them on Sunday. It depends on what church you go to, I guess. I stand corrected. The comedian Mark Maron refers to our phones as techno-narcissistic extensions, and I think that's a perfect way to put this. The phones orient us to a world where we're at the center of it, where our preferences are absolute, where we have complete sovereignty over what gets our attention. And the device makers celebrate this fact. Remember the Facebook ads where the woman's sitting at dinner and she's bored at dinner because her grandmother's talking and she pulls out her phone and all of a sudden she's escaped and she's having a snowball fight and life is better. The makers of these things celebrate the fact that they're escapist. My friend David Dark refers to smartphones as electronic soul molesters. And he's not just being funny. I think we have to ask ourselves, what does this way of life do to us? What does it do to our souls? What does it do to our capacity for love and relationships? We spend so much of our time on these devices. And then we wonder why people show up to our church and we say, oh, they're religious consumers, they're church shoppers. People hop around from church to church because of music or because the new cool preacher's over there or the new cool building is over there. The point is these things are built to disconnect us from one another. Part of what drives this, and I think this affects our local congregations tremendously, is that what's available to us here is often way more interesting than ordinary everyday life. All of us as worship leaders, we have to deal with the consequences of the fact that the bass player got sick or the guitar player broke his arm or so-and-so got laryngitis, whatever may have happened. When we show up on Sunday mornings, we're often struggling to just pull it together and pull it off. Can I get an amen? Right? And yet, on this device, at any moment, they can be streaming, worship services from a church of 10,000 people, or they can be streaming video from their favorite rock stars, their favorite rock star worship leaders. I think this is what I'm talking about when I say that there's too much power, because what begins to tempt us and what's available to us through these resources is to begin to say, well, That's where people are at. People are atomized. People are disconnected. People are addicted to this kind of media and flash and hype. And if we want to get the gospel to them, we need to ride that wave. We need to join what they're doing and go with them. And so we jump on and we follow the train of mass culture. And mass culture is Hollywood and Nashville and New York and Silicon Valley. It's TV and movies, and it's culture that's built for mass distribution, marketed to the widest possible audience. It has no concern for a sense of place or a sense of belonging. It aims at being culturally universal and thus is culturally bland. And in the words of David Foster Wallace, it's made by people who do not love you but want your money. It's really important that we recognize the fundamental difference between mass culture and other kinds of culture. Consider the cultural picture painted before of music and art being experienced within a specific context. Think about J.S. Bach or William Shakespeare. Their work wasn't written for massive, broad audiences or for posterity. It was written for the Globe Theatre in London or for parishioners and patrons in Leipzig. They were craftsmen. They were making a life for themselves. And if you read the letters of Bach, you'll see they struggled. Their work was recognized for its value and it's preserved. And again, that's what culture is meant to be. Culture is meant to be this thing where we preserve, we cultivate, we protect, we conserve the things that are built to last. Their work didn't come from big institutions. It wasn't manufactured. It wasn't made for posterity. It wasn't made for the whole world. Shakespeare was just trying to sell his next script, and Bach was just getting ready for Sundays. Compare that local, relational, even personal kind of creativity with the average Christian contemporary music hit. These rarely emerge from an artist who develops his craft and makes his way in the world. They're instead the product of hit factories, songwriters and producers and studio engineers and session musicians who crank out a hit or two a day, companies that release dozens or hundreds or thousands of songs a year, watching carefully for where a little momentum might start to happen and then throwing money and weight and energy behind it. This is true across the board in both the Christian and the non-Christian circles, and country music especially. And the exceptions to this rule, whether it's Chris Stapleton or Jason Isbell in the country world, or an artist like Sandra McCracken in the Christian world, these are exceptions that prove the rule. These people are unicorns. They're outliers to the Nashville machine that's driven by money and Spotify and YouTube, as opposed to an artist who actually has something to say. When our congregations show up on Sunday mornings, they do so after they've been inundated by this culture. They've been marketed to every waking minute of their days and lives by what we might call the Christian worship industrial entertainment complex. And the problem is that this stuff works. It's addictive, and they love it, and they can't get enough of it. For a couple of years, maybe not that long, for about 6 months, we had a pastor in our church that was hounding me and some of the other worship leaders to do the John Mark McMillan song, How He Loves. And for a variety of reasons, I didn't want to do it, largely because I thought it's not a congregational song, it's not easy to sing, and lyrically, it's weird. So we finally caved. You know, I believe in preference and deference. Sometimes you get what you prefer. Sometimes you defer to the choices of others. Chip Stam taught me that well. And so one Sunday morning, we decided to play it. And I'll never forget, I was playing guitar, and a friend of mine was leading the singing, and we start playing the intro to the song, and the guy leading the singing felt exactly the same way about the song as I did. And so we start playing the intro of the song, and he turns around, and he's white as a ghost. And he walks over to me, and he goes, I can't remember how the first line goes. I'm completely blank. I have no clue what I'm gonna do. And I just said, figure it out. But the amazing thing was, he didn't have to. He didn't have to. He walked up to the microphone, opened his mouth, didn't have it there, but the congregation did. Because they knew it. They loved it. They were waiting for us to play that song. We got so many thank yous for playing that song when we finally played it. Now, I don't want to get into the semantics of, should we have played it, should we not have played it? The point being, contemporary worship music is just one more of this mass media culture, and it's powerful, and it works, and people love it, and they're hooked to it. And the temptation is, let's ride that wave. Let's try to match it. Let's try to do what they're doing, and so we can draw in more people and have more power. The critiques of contemporary worship often miss the point. It's critiqued for being shallow, which isn't always true. It's critiqued for not being singable. But again, that's not always true. And in fact, if you go to a Hillsong concert, or a few years ago, if you'd gone to a Delirious concert and listened to the crowd as they sang these songs that were quote unquote unsingable, you'd find people sing them just fine when they're amped enough and excited enough to sing them. People critique it because it's too loud. And frankly, the loudest worship experience I've ever had in my life was in a room with a pipe organ. I actually pulled out an SPL meter in the gathering, and I know it's nerdy that I had one, but I did. And I pulled it out and checked it, and it was about 112 decibels. That's insane. The primary characteristic, the thing that we should be critical of mass culture for, is not all these other things, but that it's a consumer product. It's consumable. It has an expiration date. It's not built to last. Here's what Hannah Arendt had to say about mass culture, writing in the 1960s. She said, mass society wants not culture, but entertainment. And the wares offered by the entertainment industry are indeed consumed by the society, just like any other consumer goods. The commodities the entertainment industry offers are not things, cultural objects, whose excellence is measured by their ability to become permanent in the world. They're consumer goods, destined to be used up just like any other consumer goods. So let's play a little game here. I want you to raise your hand if you've sang one of these songs in the last 6 months. Raise your hands if you've sang 10,000 Reasons, Oceans, or Future Past. All right, keep them up now. We're gonna go back 5 years. Keep them up if you've sang Your Grace is Enough by Matt Maher, You Never Let Go, or God in the City. 6 months. God in the City. All right, 5 more years back, the big hits, according to Wow Worship. I don't know if that's real or not. Open Skies by David Crowder, or I Believe, Third Day. Oh, we're dropping like flies. 10 years. 10 years. Let's go back 15 years. I think one of these is going to get hands because it's a good song. We Fall Down, Trading My Sorrows, or That's Why We Praise Him. You got a hand or two? Okay. And let's go back even a little bit further to the 90s. Songs like, you don't have to raise your hand, but songs like Shout to the Lord, The Heart of Worship, Lord, I Lift Your Name on High, We Will Dance, a song that I'm pretty sure originated in Middle Earth. More Love, More Power, Better Is One Day, Come Now Is the Time to Worship, I Could Sing of Your Love Forever. Now, some of you might be more generous of spirit and uncynical than I am, and you might be saying, I love these tunes. But most of us realize that if we played these tunes or if we suggested these tunes, people would groan. Your pastors might groan, worship teams might groan, and you might groan as well. Because what's undeniable is that there's something about these songs, there's something about these that gets used up. They have a life cycle, and it gets used up, and they disappear. Arendt writes, the entertainment industry is confronted with gargantuan appetites. And since its wares disappear in consumption, it must constantly offer new commodities. Newness, novelty, freshness, that's the hallmark of mass culture. A song's ability to make it as a hit leans on its power to be fresh, innovative, and fresh to the ears. And this is as true in the pop world as it is in the CCM world. Now, raise your hand if you sung one of these in the last year. How Great Thou Art, Rock of Ages, What Wondrous Love Is This, On Christ the Solid Rock, Be Thou My Vision, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, O God, our help in ages past, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. So probably the vast majority of our churches have sung one of those songs. What's the difference? Why do these have this timeless quality? I think a number of factors contribute to this, but one of these is that these songs stand so clearly outside the stream of mass culture. And here's an interesting thing I want to point out, to come back to something I said earlier. If you take a song like 10,000 Reasons, I think it's a great song. I love it a lot. And when I first experienced that song, though, it comes bundled with a whole set of cultural realities. I hear a recording of it. I might stream it somewhere. I might see a video of it. On the other hand, most of us probably would have a hard time knowing what the first experience they had of a song like How Great Thou Art was. Even if you could point to the time that you heard it, the song's text and the melody immediately reveal themselves to be outside of the worship industrial entertainment world. They aren't fresh. They aren't new. They're archaic. With 10,000 Reasons or another modern song, when you go to look the thing up or you get involved with using it, you'll encounter a half dozen ownership claims on the song. It has copyright owners and publishers and distributors and a record label for the recording. And every one of these ownership claims is marked by a date. 10,000 Reasons shows up very intentionally tied to time and to people. These people made it. These people own it. They've owned it since this such and such a time. And why do these claims exist? I think we could be more high-minded if we want to, but let's be honest. They exist for money. The names and the dates indicate ownership, and ownership means a claim, a stake really, in who gets the money that such a song generates. And you can be sure that a song like 10,000 Reasons has generated a lot of money. I don't point this out to say that copyright's evil. I don't point this out to say that we should all register our new songs with Creative Commons and refuse royalties. In fact, I think the fact that a guy like Matt Redman or a Keith Getty or a Stuart Townend can devote their lives to writing songs is a good thing. But while I love those men, and I don't have any reason to believe that they're driven by money for what they do, you can be sure that along the chain there are plenty of others that are, the publishers, the distributors, the marketers, et cetera. There are a lot of people who, again, do not love you but want your money. Lots of people have a vested interest in what happens in your Sunday morning gathering. They want you to play their songs. They want you to sing their songs so that they can, again, further the distribution, sell more records, get more streaming numbers. All of these things, it's driven by a market economy that's driven by money and consumption. And then one day the thing, it's no longer fresh anymore. It goes on sale. You can get it for free. One of the dangers of mass culture, too, is that this appetite for fresh meat is so great that it can consume and destroy culture that predates it. It's one of the dangers for hymns, and I say this as one who's made several records of retuned hymns. There's a danger in retuning and co-opting these hymns as contemporary music. Arendt pointed this out when she was thinking about how mass media wanted to repackage and rework things like Shakespeare and Dante and others, appropriating them into films and movies and television. She wrote, "There are many great authors of the past who have survived centuries of oblivion and neglect, but it's still an open question whether they will be able to survive an entertaining version of what they have to say." Our appetite for consumption is huge, so hymns get retuned and repackaged and turned into modern pop gems. But what happens when that freshness wears off? Do they become stale? Do they become uncool? Do we lose them as a treasure for our church? So let me begin to try to pull this together. To return to Barry, his problem with his field was that he had too much power and too little knowledge. With the tools at his disposal, he could render a hillside into a pond and water a flock, but it turned out that doing this damaged not only the hillside, but the woods behind it, and ultimately Barry himself. It wasn't sustainable. The power created this false reality, this false momentum, this false opportunity, and Barry and his land paid the price. For pastors and worship leaders, the temptation of too much power is all around us. And the example that I'm drawing out of here today is mass culture, specifically this industrial worship entertainment complex. There are other examples of mass culture. One could talk just as seriously and with just as much concern about the culture of celebrity, about mass culture sermon series and packages and the mindless use of technology. And before you think I'm letting our tribe off the hook here, let me get a little more pointed. A sense of place means that we understand the hearts and minds of our people, that we speak in the language they understand, that we adopt the metaphors and the idioms and the rhythms of speech that define their sense of place. We think incarnationally. What would it look like for the word of God, as Eugene Peterson put it, to move into the neighborhood? The trouble with mass media is that a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama can make a hero out of John Piper in Minneapolis or Tim Keller in New York City or Martin Lloyd-Jones in 20th century London and can be so immersed in the language of their heroes and their ways of preaching and their chosen metaphors that they never really inhabit the language, the heart, and context that they're in. They end up speaking a bland Christianese, or they speak a complicated and technical theological language, and their preaching, while it might be okay, fails to actually connect with the earthy, ordinary way of life of the people that are gathering with them. The heroes themselves, Keller, Piper, and the others, they're not to blame for this. Each of those men, I believe, has actually demonstrated brilliance in speaking to and from their context. But the phenomenon of mass culture divorces them from their contexts, drops them into our laps, and makes them celebrities. And many pastors find themselves tempted to follow these models. They become like a worship leader playing the hits. They're entertaining. They might build a church as an institution, but they might fail to leave the place better than they found it, full of people who are formed and shaped by the gospel in the places they really live and work. The truth is, our church members are often content to ride this wave of mass culture. They love it. The temptation is to ride that wave of energy with them, to jump on what's happening, to jump on what's popular, to jump on what sells, to try to drive the attendance, the buildings, and the cash. And the trouble, like Barry's pond, is that it isn't sustainable. Whatever you build with the tools and power of mass culture is destined to wear itself out, to grow stale, and to need to be constantly refreshed, constantly replaced. Barry recognized that power alone wasn't the problem, that along with too much power was too little knowledge. And on the knowledge side, I want to say this briefly. I think we've become too easily convinced that people come to our churches because they want to be entertained. But what if the attraction to entertainment, though, is a misplaced spiritual longing? What if people love entertainment because they think that's the only spiritual good that the world has to offer them anymore? Perhaps more than any time in our history, we worship in the midst of serious spiritual resistance. We live in what Charles Taylor calls a secular age and what sociologists before him called an age of disenchantment. Religious and spiritual beliefs still exist, but it's always contested, always resisted. As Taylor puts it, he says, I'm never, only rarely, really sure, free of all doubt, untroubled by some objection, by some experience of life which won't fit. We cannot help looking over our shoulder from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in the conditions of doubt and uncertainty. When the church gathers for worship, then, they gather in the midst of this doubt and uncertainty. In the absence of confidence in the spiritual realities that can comfort them, give them guidance and grace, they end up looking for comforts that they can find and that they can trust within our material, immanent world. Maybe God won't show up to assure us of his grace, to comfort us with his presence, but that song can blow my mind. Maybe I can't expect comfort from my sorrows and my sadness, but maybe I can't hope for the word of Christ to dwell richly with me, but maybe I can connect to a certain feeling that can keep me going for another few days. There's a spectacular kind of hype to contemporary religious services. And that's a religious event all of its own, an emotional and an aesthetic experience that leads us to feeling supercharged or cleansed for a few days. They might be filled, but they won't be filled for long. It's the nature of mass culture. They might be comforted, but it's a comfort that relies on novelty and freshness of the device through which it's being delivered. It's going to wear out. People long for entertainment because they think this is as good as it gets. But what if we have something more to offer them? Robert Capon said that pastors should be like naughty kids who steal their parishioners' religious pills and flush them down the toilet. I love that metaphor. What might that look like for us to steal the pills of entertainment and hype and give something different to our congregations? I'm gonna try to finish quickly here. How to put the local back into local church ministry then. First off, I think we need to focus on the goal of worship. We need to focus on spiritual formation over attraction. And I think most of us, and I say this for myself, I know it's true for myself as a worship leader, that we're often dishonest with ourselves about how much attraction matters, about how much attendance matters, about how much hype on Sunday morning matters. I love this quote from Dallas Willard. He said, as pastors, we shouldn't focus on having an audience. We should focus on having something to say. We should see ourselves as worship leaders having the opportunity to curate treasures old and new rather than riding the waves of fads. What if our worship services were driven by the desire to see our congregations shaped and formed in the image of Jesus? And what if we didn't give a rip about being impressive? Mass culture seeks to temporarily satiate hunger, but it's not meant to last. Culture, in the more historic sense, is about preserving and protecting what matters, curating, not entertaining. 2, love the place you've been sent. I think this is a big deal for us. We need to learn to love our cities. We need to learn to love what the people around us love. Grow an appreciation for what makes your city a great place to live and learn what makes your city struggle. Much of this is forged in prayer. Commit to praying for your city, for its civic leaders and its public servants. I'm not gonna ask for a show of hands, but ask yourself, do you know the name of your city councilman? Do you know who represents you on the school board? Do you know the name of your mayor? Do you know what's happening in your city? How are people trying to create jobs? Where are most of the people in your church employed? What kind of economic hardships has the city endured? What are the race relationships like in your city? I'm not asking any of these questions because you necessarily need to do something about them in your services. All of these, the point is that as a pastor, as leaders, we need to know the place that we're serving and embody a love and commitment to it. And that will bleed through in the way that we love, lead, serve, and pray for our churches. And related to that, if you hate your context, if you wish you were in a cooler church and had cooler people to minister to, had a better city to live in, if any of that's in your heart, first off, you need to be honest about it. Because sometimes I think we can shame ourselves out of even acknowledging that stuff's there, that we're bitter about where we are and what kind of church we're serving. So tell the truth to yourself and tell the truth to God about it. And then begin to ask the Lord to warm your heart. If you can't be with the church you love the church you're with. God put you there. If it feels like an exile, that's okay. God told exiles to love and serve their place. 3, Cultivate a common wealth in the worship and liturgy of the church. And a lot of that's about language. I'm gonna say more on that in just a second. But spend time listening. Listen to how people talk. Listen to what they're struggling with. Listen to their angst and anxieties. Think about the music of the place where you serve. What would it sound like if tomorrow morning everybody woke up in your neighborhood and they were all saved and they started singing to Jesus? Think about the life of the city. Can you teach your church to pray for and care for the spiritual needs of the city around you? Number 4, opt out and create a counterculture. Don't chase the fads, the trends, the hits, the flash in the pan novelty of mass culture. Cultivate a blissful ignorance of what the newest hit is. Recognize that the culture of your church is something that you nurture and cultivate. Don't feel like you have to transform it overnight, but plant seeds and water them and watch for things to grow. Never sing a song because it's a hit. Choose songs because they speak to the spiritual needs of the life of your congregation. Choose songs because people need the comfort and assurance of the gospel. Labor over language. When it comes to counterculture, language, I think, is number 1. How can we communicate the gospel in a way that avoids needless jargon? Bob kind of got at this a minute ago. But one of my favorite church prayers goes something like this. It's so good to be fellowshipping with you today, church. I'm excited to begin dialoguing with you about the journey of the heart that we're taking as the Lord sanctifies and mortifies us so we can love on each other. Let's bathe this thing in prayer and ask for a hedge of protection around us. Now, if you didn't grow up in the church and you walk in and you hear that, you think, these people are crazy. What on earth did that guy just say? But we're so immersed in a Christianese, in a Christian kind of language, that we forget how to talk like normal people talk. And we really need to learn how to cultivate that. All the good rules of writing apply to preachers and worship leaders. Never use 2 words when one will do. Never use a big word when you can use a small one. Have sympathy for your audience and constantly ask themselves, why should they care about what's happening right now and what I'm saying right now? Read good writing. Read good fiction, nonfiction, poetry. Expand your available inventory of language and images and metaphors and means to communicate. And I'd argue that this is one of the things that makes Keller such an amazing preacher, is his incredible inventory of language. 5, and finally, landing the plane. Cultivate the language of lament, confession, and preparation for our encounter with death. Consider this one, which is my last point here, sort of a hack for cultivating a local culture and worship. Make sure your worship gatherings focus on the tragic side of life. How's that a hack, you might ask? That's because mass media and mass culture are absolutely allergic to suffering and death. It's not entertaining, it doesn't sell. Entertainment culture actually exists, I think, primarily to distract us from these things and to numb us from their pain. So find ways to pray about life's sorrows as a congregation. Find ways to sing about sorrows and to sing about the sorrow over our own sin or sickness or sadness that's in the world. If you're not doing this already, it will be jarring for people because they're not used to experiencing it and acknowledging it. They won't know what to do with their pain. One of my favorite memories I have as a worship leader was not long ago. I was playing guitar at a service, and I looked out. We were singing a lament song, an Indelible Grace song. And I looked out, and on the 3rd row, a few folks away from each other, there were 3 women that were sitting nearby one another. And the first one was a woman who about 6 months before that, she was working in the sex industry in Louisville. She was stripping, she was prostituting, she was addicted to all kinds of drugs. And a few months prior to this, she got saved, she got baptized, and she's been transitioning out of that life. And so we're singing this lament song, and I'm looking at her. And then a few feet away from her is one of my best friends. She's a surgeon. She's a surgeon in the city of Louisville. And I knew because her husband and she and her husband had come over that week and had dinner with me and my wife. I knew that she'd had a horrific week. She'd had a couple of patients die on the table when she was operating on them, and it's an extremely rare thing for her. But so here she is again, elite surgeon, makes gobs and gobs of money, sitting a few seats away from somebody who just got out of the sex industry, and they're both singing their sorrows. And then to make it even more overwhelming, a few seats away from them was a woman, 27 years old. She has a 1-year-old daughter, and she has months to live. She's been battling colon cancer for the last year. Basically, right after her daughter was born, she was diagnosed. And it's extremely aggressive. She's had 3 brain surgeries in the last year. And they're all sitting in this row together, and we're singing these laments. And to me, it's such a reminder that what the church needs is not entertainment or hype or distraction. They need to gather with the saints and reckon with life's sorrows at the foot of the cross. And they need to hear an assurance that one day all of those sorrows are going to end. They need to hear that clearly in language they understand, in a way that connects to their everyday life, and that reminds them that this place, this city, this gathering is all part of God's advancing kingdom. Thanks.